So, you want to know if you can starve your cancer. I'm guessing you're a cancer patient, or at the very least you know someone who is a cancer patient, and you're thinking, is it somehow possible to outlive my diagnosis by changing my diet to one that doesn't fuel my cancer and instead starves it? That question is exactly what today's video is going to be about. My name is Cedric. I'm one of the co-founders of Marchwood, where we help cancer patients such as yourself outlive their diagnosis. We do this using what we term the mosaic method. And just recently, we helped one of our clients go from a purported life expectancy of less than 18 months to now a life expectancy of 5 years or more just within 5 months. And honestly, that result to me myself is still quite amazing. But how does that pertain to you? What did he do and how did he starve his cancer? In order to understand that, we have to look a bit at biology and the biology of your cells. The central point with starvation really is that all life and thus all cells need energy to survive. Without energy, they die, right? And that goes for all of your cells. That goes for your brain cells, for your liver cells, for your heart muscle cells, for your skeletal muscle cells. Any cells in your body need energy. If they don't get energy, they die off, right? There's no two ways about it. Of course, that's fantastic if we can somehow starve our cancer cells, right? If the cancer cells don't get energy, then the cancer cells die, which is exactly what we want. Of course, vice versa, we don't want your healthy cells to starve. So, because that would mean you yourself as a complete person would die. So the question is it somehow possible to selectively starve only the cancer cells and at the same time maintaining energy and nourishment to the rest of our body? The problem with that is that cancer cells reside within our body. Now, with, for example, a bit of a macabre example, if you wanted to starve another person, you could simply not provide them with food, right? You could simply take away any food that they would like to eat. That's kind of physical starvation, I'll call it, right? Because you're just not allowing them to eat. With cancer cells, since they reside within your body, that's not really an option. You can't just not eat for them because they have access to anything that enters your body, right? It enters your body, your digestive tract, your bloodstream, and then you really have no control whether it becomes available to cancer cells or to your healthy cells. So we have to look at how cancer cells and how healthy cells get their energy from the food you eat. Because if there's a difference in the ways they do this, maybe you can utilize that and only eat foods that do not contain nutrients or fuel to your cancer cells, but that do contain fuel that your healthy cells can use. In order to understand that, we have to look at the ways that cells produce and get energy. Your cells have two main pathways of getting energy. The first one is cellular respiration. Cellular respiration requires oxygen and is very efficient. If oxygen isn't available, for example, this can be the case in your muscles during high-intensity workouts, right, where the blood doesn't provide enough oxygen, your cells have the ability to switch to anaerobic fermentation instead. In comparison to cellular respiration, anaerobic fermentation is way less efficient, but sometimes it is simply necessary. However, because it is much less efficient, your healthy cells much prefer cellular respiration, because for the same amount of fuel that they burn and the same amount of waste product, they get much more energy out of it. And they only rely and fall back on anaerobic fermentation when cellular respiration isn't possible for whatever reason. Cancer cells, in comparison, rely much more heavily on anaerobic fermentation, even in cases where oxygen is readily available, which just seems counterintuitive because cancer cells grow rapidly. They grow rampantly and uncontrolledly, which makes them so dangerous. But you would think that uncontrolled and rapid growth requires a lot of energy, which would mean that cancer cells would rely on the more efficient energy metabolism. But we see that in comparison to healthy cells at least, they rely much more heavily on the inefficient anaerobic fermentation. Now, the degree to which this happens, this is a quick disclaimer, depends and varies with each cancer. It's not that every cancer almost entirely relies on anaerobic fermentation. That varies, and without going into specific analysis of any one type of cancer, any one specific cancer cell, you cannot really determine that. But the thing that holds true is that for all cancer cells, anaerobic fermentation is upregulated in comparison to healthy cells. But why is that? Why do cancer cells seemingly choose the inefficient energy metabolism without having to? To understand that, we have to look at the anatomy of a cell and how that differs between a healthy cell and a cancer cell, and how that can impact the metabolism. So here you can see a healthy cell. You can see the nucleus, which is where the genome is contained. You can see the cytosol, and then you can see the mitochondria. Now, the mitochondria are kind of subunits of our cells, and they have a bunch of different functions, but the only thing that really matters for us, since we're looking at starvation and energy metabolism only, is that the last step of cellular respiration occurs within these mitochondria, whilst the majority of anaerobic fermentation occurs within the cytosol. That means that without the mitochondria, you cannot have cellular respiration, whilst without mitochondria, you can still have anaerobic fermentation. And that's where it becomes interesting when you look at a cancer cell, because cancer cells have damaged mitochondria, and because of this, they have a reduced ability for cellular respiration. Now, if we go back here to the energy that cancer cells derive from anaerobic fermentation, all of a sudden it makes sense, because cancer cells require a lot of energy because of their rampant growth. However, they are not as capable of the efficient cellular respiration due to their damaged mitochondria, which means that they have to compensate by upregulating anaerobic fermentation. Because otherwise, right, if you only downregulated cellular respiration but didn't upregulate something else to compensate, they would simply have too little energy available and die off. For us, that means if we can somehow hamper the anaerobic fermentation of cancer cells, if we can somehow inhibit their ability to compensate, we can hamper their growth, we can significantly decrease the energy available to them. Now, once again, simply inhibiting anaerobic fermentation isn't going to necessarily kill all cancer cells. Taking away their ability to compensate will hamper their growth, completely stop their growth, or kill them. All three are good outcomes, regardless of the degree. Okay, but how do you hamper anaerobic fermentation? How do we inhibit the anaerobic fermentation of cancer cells? That's a really good question, and it's a central part of this whole problem. The good thing for us is that not all fuels are fermentable. Not all the nutrients in the food you eat can be used in anaerobic fermentation. For example, fatty acids can only be metabolized through cellular respiration. So, if a cancer cell only has fatty acids available, it would not be able to perform anaerobic fermentation. Now, which fuels are fermentable, you might be asking? Well, the most common fuel in your body is sugars. There's, of course, various forms of sugars, such as glucose, mannose, galactose, but the details don't really matter because all sugars can be fermented. Wonderful! So I just don't eat sugar. You might be thinking, stay away from the candy and that's going to solve the problem, because no sugar, less fermentation, cancer gets less energy, it grows slower, and it is starved. There's a slight problem with that, and that is the fact that you have to eliminate all carbohydrates. The thing is that carbohydrates, as for example fructose in apples and fruits, or even the complex carbohydrates such as starch in bread, are all metabolized into sugar within your body. So in terms of fermentability, even the complex carbohydrates from bread are broken down into simple sugars that can then be fermented by your cancer cells. That means that if you want to reduce the fermentable fuel available to your cancer cells, you have to eliminate all carbohydrates, because otherwise, if you only leave out the candy but keep the bread will simply still be fermentable. But on the flip side, if you do eliminate all carbohydrates, you achieve exactly what we wanted. You can inhibit the ability for anaerobic fermentation by simply reducing the food available to the cancer cell, right? If it has no sugar available, it can't ferment that sugar because it's simply not available. And now it's left with the damaged mitochondria, the lower capacity for cellular respiration, and thus simply has less energy available, effectively starving it to an extent. With some cancer cells, once again, as I said, this might be enough to completely kill them. But for all cancer cells, it will reduce the energy available, hamper their growth, and thus give you a better chance at fighting it. Now, at the end here, before I let you go, I want to make one last thing perfectly clear. Abstinence from carbohydrates, while it undoubtedly will hamper cancer growth, isn't necessarily a be-all end-all solution. Of course, in some cases, simple abstinence from carbohydrates might be enough to kill the cancer cells completely. In many cases, it even is. But you can't be certain, and as such, it's best to combine it with various other interventions. Now, diving into all of those would be way too much for this video. It would completely go beyond the scope of it. But if you're curious nonetheless, in the description below you can find a link to the free Mosaic method guide, where you can find all of the steps that we can generally recommend to any cancer patient if he wants to fight his cancer and outlive it. You also find the scientific rationale and the sources behind it, so you don't just simply have to believe some random people on the internet, but you can actually look into the literature and the scientific reasoning behind it, so that you know that we're not simply telling you some fairy story. Now, with all that out of the way, I hope you learned something today about carbohydrates and how they might be fueling your cancer growth, and I wish you swift healing. Cheers.